So good morning. My name is Gianna Baker. I am the co-executive director of the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance, also known as CAFHA. I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining our session today. Today's webinar is hosted by Housing Choice Partners, the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance, and Prairie State Legal Services. We would also like to thank Todd Fuller at the Illinois Department of Human Services for helping us today with hosting this session. Next slide. So we have a 4-part fair housing training series, and just to remind you of what we will be talking about in the next 4 weeks is that first we'll get started today with just providing some fundamentals on fair housing, and then spending most of our time talking about reasonable accommodations and modifications for people with disabilities. On November 2nd, we're going to talk about housing protections for people with arrest and conviction records. We will also discuss sealing and expunging records, which is a process to provide legal relief to individuals when they do have a record. On November 9th, we will discuss statewide source of income protections and strategies for working with landlords. And then finally, on November 16th, we will discuss housing protections for victims and survivors of domestic violence. And we will also cover housing protections for immigrant households. Next slide. So as we get started today, we just wanted to cover a few housekeeping notes. So number one, the purpose of this session is really just to provide fair housing education. This is not legal advice. Number two, we would ask that you put your questions in the chat, and then we'll have some time toward the end of our presentation that we'll spend covering any questions that have been asked. Now, we do recognize that we are expecting up to 300 or more people to join us today. So with that in mind, we're going to do our best to try to cover questions. If there are some questions that we're unable to cover, we'll work with our expert presenters that we have with us today, like Prairie State Legal Services, and those we are partnering with for the remaining of our sessions to try to get some answers to those questions for you if we're unable to cover them during the presentation. And then we do want you to know that when this series is over, so this series will be over on November 16th, you will receive an email, and that email will include copies of the PowerPoint slides for each presentation and additional information to help you. Next slide. And just wanted to briefly cover what our agenda looks like for today. We're going to discuss what fair housing is. We'll cover our federal and state fair housing laws. And then we're going to spend most of our time talking about fair housing rights for people with disabilities. Toward the end, we will have time for Q&A. And now I'm going to turn it over to Nastasha Flowers to get us started.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Gianna. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nastasha Flowers. I am the Community Engagement Manager for Housing Choice Partners. And so before we go over our fair housing laws, we first want to acknowledge how we got here and why segregation exists. And with that, of course, we need to recognize that we still have a very long way to go to realizing the promise of fair housing. And that is because of the history of intentional segregation and legalized discrimination. So segregation exhibited not only in Chicago or Cook County, but across the state of Illinois is the direct result of historic government-sponsored policies and programs intended to keep populations separated by race and ethnicity and serve to create a hierarchy of value, both individual and community value based on race and ethnicity. Due to these intentional public policy decisions, as reflected in the quote on your screen, Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color face unconscionable disparities, including lack of public and private investments, environmental health hazards, and other barriers, which make upward mobility much more difficult than it is within white communities. So to start us off, the Fair Housing Act was a direct response to the 1960 civil rights movement and the history we touched on. In 1968, Congress passed the long fought for a Fair Housing Act banning discrimination in the sale of rental or rental of housing, excuse me. This law also requires that the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, and HUD recipients of HUD dollars do everything possibly to affirmatively further fair housing, thus requiring that cities and local governments undo the harm caused by segregation. Fair housing is about opening housing options, linking people to opportunity, and creating investment in areas that have faced historic disinvestment. It is creating living patterns that are more balanced, diverse, and enhance access to opportunities. These laws are crucial since housing is a centerpiece that links people to schools, employment opportunities, transportation options, safe environments, and so on. It really determines who has access to various opportunities. So to begin looking at fair housing and fair housing laws, we'll start with what is fair housing. So fair housing laws protect people and guarantee their right to live where they choose, have equal access to seek, purchase, or sell or rent housing, and enjoy the full use of their homes without unlawful discrimination, interference, coercion, threats, or intimidation by owners, landlords, real estate agents, or any other persons, including someone who lives next door or in the building. So now that we've kind of covered the basics of fair housing and where we began in the Fair Housing Act, we want to look at fair housing violations, protected classes, and prohibited acts. So it's important that we make sure we all have a clear understanding of how these laws work and how they protect people. So we're going to start with the most basic level and discuss what a fair housing violation is. So a fair housing violation occurs when a prohibited act is made against someone because they belong to a protected class. Keeping in mind this simple equation is really helpful. And so it's always a protected class plus a prohibited act equals a fair housing violation. So now that we have the equation, and now we are going to break down even more and dive into what it actually means when someone says they're protected in a protected class. So a protected class is a group of people who share characteristics protected by law from discrimination. So the law says certain characteristics cannot be factored into a housing decision, and that a landlord, agent, or property manager or any other type of housing provider cannot discriminate against someone because of these characteristics, such as race. The term protected class simply refers to a group of people who share those characteristics protected by law from discrimination. It is important to recognize that a person is not just protected because they belong to one of these protected classes or have one of those characteristics. The protection extends to perceived or associational connections to the protected class as well. To explain and give more context to what we mean, take, for example, a woman whose landlord perceives her to be a lesbian because she does not conform to their perception of what a heterosexual woman dresses or acts like. If she were treated differently because she is perceived to be a lesbian, even though she is not, she would still be protected. So there are fair housing protections at different levels of government, and each level affords protections to some different protected classes. Today, we are going to look at state and federal protections. And so we have a couple of protections that we want to try to cover, so please bear with us. So on your screen, you should see a list that lists the 7 protected classes at the federal level. So that is race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, and familial status. So very quickly, we're going to look at some particular ones and call out some of the less obvious ones. So the first one is going to be sex. This also extends protections against sexual harassment, which we will talk about in detail later in another session. And since Biden took office, his administration has directed HUD to interpret this protection to extend to sexual orientation as well as gender identity. Natural origin refers to the country you or your ancestors may have come from. And familial status means people who have children under the age 18 in their home, are pregnant or perceived to be pregnant, or people in the process of securing legal custody of a minor child, including adoptive or foster parents. At the state level, through the Illinois Human Rights Act, we have all of the same protections as we do at the federal level, plus sexual orientation, ancestry, age, marital status, military or veteran status, including unfavorable discharge and order of protection status. When we say specifically mean age, we mean you cannot be treated differently for being someone who is 40 plus years old. The protection does not extend to those below 40 years old. So the question that we often ask is, are you in a protected class? And the answer is yes. We are all in multiple protected classes and we all have fair housing rights, which sometimes can be confusing because oftentimes people think I'm in one, but I'm not in multiple protected classes. So everyone is in a protected class and oftentimes multiple protected classes. So now that we've spent a little bit of time going through the protected classes, let's get into the second part of the equation, which is prohibited acts. So prohibited acts can be direct actions taken, written or unwritten policies, or even housing advertisements that discourage or prevent you from obtaining housing or enjoying the full use of your home. So a couple of examples of prohibited acts include refusing or refusal to rent, lying about the availability of a unit, steering towards particular units, buildings, or communities, or failure to make a reasonable accommodation or modification, which we will go into further detail next with our colleague Maya from Prairie State Legal. Continuing to look at more prohibited acts, that would include interfering with the ability to enjoy or feel safe in a unit, making or publishing discriminatory statements, aiding and abetting, sexual harassment, treating people differently by giving different lease terms, privileges, or services, or retaliating against or intimidating a person for reporting discrimination. So we want to test your knowledge a little bit since we've gone over protected classes and what some of the prohibited acts are. So we have this scenario that we would like you to think about and see what your answer would be. So the scenario is that a couple and their 2 children view a 2-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a large apartment building. The couple asks the landlord if the unit they were viewing was available. The landlord says, no, not this unit. Children are only allowed in the first floor units. I'm sorry, but we don't have any first floor units available right now. Is this a fair housing violation? Yes or no? Please type your response in the chat and let us know your reason for the answer. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly look into the chat and see. So I see several yeses, a yes with an exclamation point, a yes with familial status discrimination. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, great. So yeah, this is So yes, this is illegal and this is a fair housing violation. The reason being is because we have a protected class, familial status, and actually 2 separate prohibited acts taking place, steering and denial. So the protected class is the familial status, a couple and their 2 children. The prohibited act, the first one is steering, so that the statement of the children are only allowed in first floor units. And then the second prohibited act is denial. We don't have any first floor units available right now, and your family is only allowed to rent a first floor unit. So next, we're going to turn it over to Maya to further go into greater detail around reasonable accommodations and modifications and fair housing as it pertains to persons with a disability as well. And I'm going to stop my sharing my screen. So Maya.
Thank you. Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
I am going to try share my screen now. So let me know if this works.
Great, we can see it. Oh, but now you're muted.
Okay, technical difficult. It says that my microphone is disabled whenever I share my screen. Do you know if that's a setting you can change for me?
Let me see.
I'll try again. I'll try doing it as my entire screen instead of a tab, but. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, maybe it was just that I shared a tab instead of a screen. That was weird. Okay, cool. Sorry about that, everybody. My name is Maya Zivell. I am a fair housing attorney at Prairie State Legal Services. If you haven't heard of us, Prairie State Legal Services, we're a legal aid organization. We cover pretty much all the counties. If you cut Illinois in half, pretty much the top half of Illinois, except for Cook County, because there are other legal aid organizations based in Cook County. But we cover pretty much every county around that. And like I said, I'm a fair housing attorney there, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications. That's me. I will have my contact information at the end of the presentation as well. So in case we don't get to your questions, or if you come up with other questions later, you can feel free to contact me. Before I start, I believe there were some questions in the chat about whether the presentation will be available afterwards, and I think it will be. Is that correct? I think we are providing it.
That is correct. The presentation, along with any resources provided, will be sent out after the training series concludes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nastasha. All right, so this is me, and let's get started here. So like I said, I'm going to be speaking to you today. Oh, whoops, my disclaimer. I'm a lawyer. I have to give a little disclaimer. We're not going to talk about specifically legal issues. I can't give specifically legal advice specifically without a client, but so we're just going to talk about the law in general. All right, let's get started. Protections for people with disabilities. And like I said, we're going to talk about accommodations and modifications. This is such an important part of my work. I'm really excited to be the one to be presenting on this today, because quite honestly, dealing with reasonable accommodations and modifications consumes at least 50% of my clients, fair housing clients. I just have so many. This issue just comes up so much. And I know that I'm not unique in that. I know that if you were to ask other fair housing attorneys or fair housing organizations across the country, they would probably tell you the same thing. It's just the most prevalent type of fair housing complaint that I see, that probably many people see. So let's get into what it is. So first of all, before I tell you about accommodations and modifications, what is a disability? A disability, this definition comes directly from the Fair Housing Act. It's a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities. Physical or mental impairment, okay, that's clear. So it can be physical or mental. It has to substantially limit, so have a, what substantially means, right? Have a pretty big effect on a major life activity. What is a major life activity? I will give you some examples. Here are some examples in that square there on the right of major life activities. Major life activity, just like it sounds, it's any activity that is important to daily life, right? Anything on there is important to your day-to-day life. Caring for yourself, seeing, hearing, eating, communicating with others. These are probably, we do most of these things pretty much every day. Someone with a disability, whether it be physical or mental, it substantially affects one or more of these major life activities. Either it makes it more difficult for them, they do not have that major life activity, they cannot do that particular activity, or they can only do it under very specific circumstances. So here we go, reasonable accommodations. Before I actually thought of one more thing I wanted to mention, because I know that there were a couple of questions about the ADA beforehand, and I want to make clear that for the most part today, I am talking about the Fair Housing Act. I will reference 504 as well in a few minutes, but the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, we are not talking about that today, because that law protects people with disabilities in public places, in places that are open to the public. We are talking about discrimination and the rights of people with disabilities in their homes and in places that are not generally open to the public. Technically, in an apartment complex, you could probably argue there are some places that are open to the public, like a management office, parking lot if it's open to the public. But for the most part, we are talking about the Fair Housing Act here. So for the first 15 minutes of today, you were hearing about fair housing laws in general and how kind of the crux of the law is treat everybody the same, right? No matter what your protected class, no matter who you are, everybody should be treated equally. Well, in terms of the rights of people with disabilities, they have these extra rights that the other groups don't have. So here is one example in fair housing where we're not treating everybody the same. We are treating people with disabilities differently because they have these extra rights that the other groups don't have. And these are the rights to reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications so that they can more fully enjoy their home, their property, just as somebody who does not have their disability can enjoy it. Reasonable accommodation means that a person with a disability has the right to ask for a change or an exception to a rule or a policy. It has to be related to their disability, but it would be a change or an exception to a rule or policy to help them, like I said, more fully enjoy their property. I put some pictures up here I tried to pick the ones that were most common to me that I see very often. The one on the left, just to give you examples of how reasonable accommodations kind of play out in real life. So these are ones that I've personally worked with clients on several times. The one on the left, you see that the lady with that adorable little dog there. I wanted that picture to illustrate emotional support animals and service animals. So a lot of housing there are no pets policies. So if somebody has an emotional support animal or a service animal, they can ask for a reasonable accommodation, an exception to that no pets policy, to allow their service animal or emotional support animal in the housing. Similarly, if the housing does allow pets, but maybe there's a pet fee, like a pet deposit or a monthly pet fee, the person with the disability would have the right to ask for a reasonable accommodation, an exception to that fee, asking that the pet fee or pet deposit be waived. I am sure you have a lot of questions. I always get a lot of questions about emotional support animals. So don't worry, we are going to be talking about it in a few minutes in a lot more detail, because we're going to be working through like a hypothetical specifically about emotional support animals. So don't worry, we hold your questions on that for a little bit. I promise, hopefully I'll be able to answer them soon. That second one there, that second picture illustrates another common accommodation that I have helped clients with, which is asking for a transfer from a second floor or higher unit to a first floor apartment in a building that doesn't have an elevator. Sometimes, you know, people take an apartment that does not, in a building that does not have an elevator. Maybe they didn't have their disability at the time that they moved into the second floor. Maybe it wasn't as bad, or maybe they just took it because that was all that was available and they needed a place. Whatever the reason, it doesn't matter. If that person has difficulty because of their disability climbing the stairs, they have the right to ask for an accommodation to move, to be transferred to a first floor unit, or a unit that doesn't have stairs. So that's another one I've done a lot. And then also on the right there, that reserved parking space illustrates, okay, so two things. First of all, in a lot of apartment complexes, there are no reserved parking spaces at all. People just park wherever they can find a spot. Someone with a disability may need, because of their disability, a parking spot as close as possible to the front of the building. They can't, maybe they have some kind of mobility impairment, they can't walk long distances. They need that spot guaranteed as close as possible to the door. So a reasonable accommodation request would be to ask, even though there's no reserved parking spaces in general at the property, giving them a reserved parking space just for them at the front of the building that they can use. Or similarly, if there are assigned parking spaces and somebody has a spot that's maybe assigned further away from the building, asking that the spots be reorganized so that the person's spot is as close as possible to the front of the building. So those are some pictures. I have a list here of a few other accommodations that are fairly common, I think, to me at least in my practice. That these ones don't have pictures, but here's some other examples of things that have come up a lot for me lately. Hoarding is a big one. I think I've tried to theorize with some of my coworkers recently of why it seems like this has become more prevalent. I think maybe just speculation. It seems to have become worse after the pandemic, maybe with people being home more, but it is an issue. It is a disability, and a lot of times a hoarder can get a lease violation for the condition of their unit, or a landlord may attempt to evict them because of the condition in their unit not being in compliance with the lease. So I have made reasonable accommodation requests asking for more time to bring their unit into compliance. Because it's a disability, they may need more time, they may need help. So that's one example. Another one, changing the rent due date. As many of you know, Social Security payments are received on the 3rd of the month. Most rent is due on the 1st of the month. So for someone who receives payments related to their disability, asking for a change in the due date to the 3rd of the month, that's another example of a reasonable accommodation. Adding a live-in aid to the lease is another really common one. Adding someone a live-in aid, or maybe there's somebody, maybe the person didn't need the aid when they first moved in, but now they need to add the person to the lease. Sometimes there's apartment complexes that have visitor policies too. This is not exactly live-in aid, but they have visitor policies. Visitors can't stay over more than a certain number of nights, or visitors can't be there after a certain time of the day. So a person could also make an accommodation request for an exception to the visitor policies if they have someone that needs to come more frequently or come at night or something to assist them as a caregiver or as an aide. And then finally, here we have an extra bedroom. Sometimes this is more applicable really in subsidized housing or public housing, where the number of bedrooms corresponds with the size of the household. But a person with a disability may need an additional bedroom, either because they have a live-in aid, so they need a bedroom for that aid. A lot of times they may have exercise equipment or that they use for physical therapy, or equipment related to their disability. I had a client that had in his extra bedroom, like a portable shower lift and wheelchair. So those are examples of reasons someone might need an extra bedroom. This list is, as you have probably guessed, not exhausted. There are probably thousands of reasonable accommodations. I tried to think of some of the most common ones to me, but the list it's limitless. There are many other examples of reasonable accommodations. And I'm going to tell you about the limitations on them in just a few minutes. But before I do, let me tell you about the other rights of people with disabilities, which is the right to request reasonable modifications. So as I said, accommodations means an exception to asking for an exception to a rule or a policy. A reasonable modification means that a person with a disability has the right to request physical changes to the property. So this is usually for somebody with, obviously, with a physical disability. Here's some examples on the left there. We have an accessible bathroom. We have you can see a walk-in shower. There's a grab bar in the shower. There's some handlebars on the side of the toilet. There's a floating vanity for somebody to pull up to in a wheelchair, maybe. There's the second one in the middle, that second picture in the middle, we see widening a doorway that may need to be widened for somebody in a wheelchair to be able to fit through the doorway. The third picture, a really common one, a ramp. If there's a building or some kind of housing where there's some steps or a step that a person cannot climb that step, requesting that a ramp be put in there. And then finally, again, this list is not exhaustive. There's a smoke detector there for somebody with a hearing impairment that maybe can't hear it. There is also requesting that there's like a flashing light so that they can identify when there may be some kind of alarm going off. Now, very important. This is the number one question that I always get about modifications. Who pays for the modification? So if it is, here's the answer. If it is private housing, and that includes people who use housing choice vouchers, Section 8 vouchers, that in those cases, the tenant pays for the modification. The landlord could pay if they were generous or wanted to, but they are under no obligation to pay for the physical changes to the property if it's somebody that is using a housing choice voucher in private housing or a private housing in general. The tenant is responsible for paying for those, which, as you can probably guess, is definitely a barrier for a lot of tenants, especially a lot of the low-income tenants that I work with, because a lot of these modifications can be very expensive. If the housing receives federal funds, subsidized housing, public housing, then most of the time, the housing provider, the landlord, is responsible for paying for the modification. I say most of the time because we're going to talk in a minute about financial burdens and whether something is a financial burden maybe to deny a request, but 99% of the time, if it's federal subsidized housing, the housing provider is responsible for paying for it. And that comes from a different law, and which I won't talk about too much, but just so if you're curious where it comes from, that does come from Section 504 of the Rehab Act, which is statute that talks about the right not discriminating against people with disability in any program that receives federal funds. It doesn't just apply to housing, but in Section 504, it specifically talks about reasonable accommodations. It actually doesn't distinguish between modification. It calls everything an accommodation, but it does in that law as well put the burden on housing providers who receive federal funds, have to grant accommodations and modifications, and are also responsible for covering the costs of those. Regardless of who pays for the modification, a landlord can require that if the tenant is going to I guess this more so applies if the tenant is going to pay, the landlord can require that the tenant get permission first. That makes sense, right? That they get permission before making a change to the landlord's property. the landlord can require that it be done professionally with permits if required, meaning the landlord can require that it be done by someone professional in that industry. If I have somebody, maybe a family member that I know can install a ramp for much less than a company that professionally does that, the landlord would have the right to tell me, no, you need to get a company that does this for their work, that's licensed, bonded, insured to install this for you. They have that right to require that. And sometimes they have the right to require the person who's made the physical change to restore the unit to the original condition when they move out. But that is only if the modification would affect the usage for the next tenant. So let me give you some examples. If it doesn't affect the usage of the next tenant, then they don't have the right to ask that it be restored. So let's see, asking that a doorway be widened, say a tenant widened the doorway in the property, right, to allow their wheelchair to fit through. If the next tenant comes along, that wider doorway would not affect their usage of the property. However, if a tenant modified a kitchen, for example, to lower the cabinets so that they could reach the cabinets, that could affect the next tenant's usage if that tenant did not have a disability that required lower cabinets, right? So in that case, the landlord could require that the tenant restore the unit, and that expense to restore the unit would be on the tenant as well. Let's see here. So think about these. Let's look at that first bullet point first. What if I asked for an accommodation for a walk-in bathtub, and my landlord said to me, oh, instead of giving you a walk-in bathtub, because I can move you to a different unit at this property that already has a walk-in bathtub. What do you think about that? Think about that for a minute. I can't look at the chat, so because I'm sharing my screen. If Nastasia, if you want to unmute and let me know what some people are saying, otherwise I'll go on in a minute if people aren't participating. What do you think? Please.
We have a couple of responses. So one is steering. Another one says it would be fine. Someone else says steering as well.
Okay.
So yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. Okay, so the answer is that the tenant does not have to accept that. The tenant does not have to accept as an alternative to the landlord making a modification. If a landlord offers to move them instead to another unit instead of making the modification, the tenant does not have to accept that. And that comes from HUD guidance on reasonable modifications. That's where a lot of what I'm saying comes for is not explicitly stated in the law. It comes from HUD memos, HUD guidance, case law where this issue has been litigated. So that's the answer to that one. A tenant does not have to, I mean, they can accept it if they want to, but they're not required to. They can insist that the modification, that the walk-in tub be installed in their unit instead. Okay, what about this second one here? What if I need to install a railing? I have like front steps up to my front door, and I want to install railings because there's no railings on the side of the door. And my landlord tells me, the railings that you're installing, they don't match the style of our apartment complex. You need to change them so they conform with the style of our complex. What do you think about that? Any thoughts? Do you think that's okay or not okay?
So we have several not okays, okay for the landlord to ask, and the rest are not okay, and some okays.
Thank you. Okay, so in general, most of the time it's not okay. A landlord cannot require that a landlord can't refuse a modification just because the landlord doesn't think that it's aesthetically pleasing or that it doesn't conform to the style of the complex. There's one exception, and that exception is if the modification, if what the landlord is proposing, like if the landlord says, well, this railing really is more in style with our property. If that alternative that the landlord wants does not cost more, is not more expensive, and if it achieves the exact same thing for the person with the disability. And remember, the person with the disability is always the one who knows the best whether it'll work for them or not. But if it does, and it's not more expensive, and it meets their need exactly the same as the other railing, then I think it would be reasonable for the landlord. But in most cases, it is not okay for the landlord to demand that. So here's kind of my thinking process, your thinking process. This is how you should think through a reasonable accommodation or a reasonable modification request. We're going to spend a little bit of time now talking about 4 and 5. So number 1, a housing provider has to know that a tenant is disabled, right? A housing provider has to actually, in order to grant a request for an accommodation or modification, a housing provider has to know that the tenant has a disability, either because the tenant has told them that they have a disability, or if it's on what we call obvious or apparent disability, meaning just by looking at the person, the landlord can identify what the disability is. In that case, the housing provider would know without the person telling them. The housing provider needs to know the accommodation or modification has to be necessary to help with the effects of the disability. There has to be some kind of nexus, some kind of connection between what the person is asking for and their disability. That makes sense too, right? Because the whole point is to alleviate symptoms of the disability, to help them more fully enjoy their property. It has to have some kind of connection to the disability. The tenant, number 3, the tenant needs to make a request for the accommodation or the modification, or the need is obvious. Most of the time it's not obvious, but in some cases, I'll talk about that again when we go through our hypothetical. But most of the time, 99% of the time, the tenant has to actually request it. The landlord can't be a mind reader. So the tenant has to explain what they're asking for and why it's related to their disability. And this is key, the accommodation or modification has to be reasonable, right? That word reasonable is in the term itself, right? Reasonable accommodation, reasonable modification. Well, like everything in the law, the word reasonable is very subjective. There is no, what's reasonable in one situation is not always reasonable in another situation. It's very case by case specific. But when I mean it has to be a reasonable request, I mean what it says there under A, the request does not impose an undue financial or administrative burden on the landlord, and B, it does not require the housing provider or landlord to fundamentally alter the nature of their services. I will give you some examples of what those two mean in just a moment. But so like I said, these are very case by case specific. So what's an undue, something that might, so for when I mean case by case, I mean like something that is a financial burden to one landlord might not be a financial burden to a landlord that has more financial resources. So, and it also depends on what the cost is, right? Of course, of what the person is asking for. But those are kind of the parameters, the main parameters of what is reasonable. And like I said, I'm going to give you examples of both of those, I think on the next slide. And then finally, before we go into those examples, the last step is, in order to grant the request for, this is mostly referring to a reasonable accommodation, there can't be a direct threat. A landlord can deny a request if there is a direct threat, which is a threat to health or safety of others or of the property of others, and no other alternative accommodation could lessen that direct threat. And like I said, I know I keep saying I'm going to talk about that example in a minute, but I really am. I promise. When we go through our hypothetical in a minute, I'm going to also give you an example of what direct threat looks like. But before I do, this is something that I think housing providers that work with people who make accommodation and modification requests really need to keep in mind. Reasonable accommodation and modifications require of the housing provider that they enter into this interactive process, this negotiation or discussion with the person making the request. It's not a make the request and then yes, no, yes, yes, it's accepted, no, it's not accepted, that's the end. It is an ongoing discussion. Even if the housing provider doubts that the person, is skeptical about the request and needs more information, and even if the verification that the person has provided maybe doesn't look reliable, or they haven't provided any verification letters, even if the landlord, even if there is some kind of direct threat or maybe a financial burden, even if the landlord can't actually accommodate the person, maybe what they're asking for can't actually be done. Even in all of those circumstances, the landlord cannot just say, nope, your request is denied, that's it. The landlord has a duty to have a discussion with the tenant, to ask for more information, to discuss what's lacking, and see if they can come up with another alternative that will work for the person making the request. Let me give you a few examples of how this would play out. So yeah, now I am giving you some examples. All right, example number one, and this is an example with a financial burden. So suppose we have a person with a disability who, because of his disability, he can't take the trash to the dumpster out back behind the apartment building because the dumpster has a really heavy lid, and the person with the disability doesn't have the strength to open the lid to the dumpster, so they can't take their trash out. That person makes a reasonable accommodation request to their landlord that they send someone to his apartment every day to take his trash and take it to the dumpster. Now, that may be an undue financial burden on the landlord. They might say that is really expensive. That would be really expensive for us to send someone to your unit every day. So that's not a reasonable request, but that's not where the conversation could end. The landlord has to then think, well, what's another thing that I could do instead that maybe will help accommodate this person, instead of sending someone to their unit each day? Maybe they could instead have an extra, maybe they could offer, all right, you can't open that, maybe we'll put an extra smaller garbage can next to the dumpster, and that does not have a lid. You can put your garbage into that smaller garbage, and then once a week we will have someone there that transfers the garbage to the dumpster that you can't open. That's an example of the interactive process and a way to get over that possibly that financial burden. Another example, this one with administrative burden. Suppose we have a tenant who has a disability, a mobility impairment. Their disability affects their ability to walk. The person with the disability can't get to the grocery store. They ask, as a reasonable accommodation, they ask for the landlord to drive them to the grocery store, to take them grocery shopping. Do you think that would be an administrative burden? Would that? Probably, yes, right? They are not normally in the business. Landlords are not normally in the business of driving their tenants to grocery stores, right? So that would, in most cases, would not be a reasonable request. That could create a burden on the landlord. But what could the landlord say in those cases? Maybe they could say, well, we can't do that. That would create a burden on us. But maybe we could create an exception to our parking policy, so that if you have someone from the community that's helping you shop, that's coming to take you to shop, that person can park in a spot here, even though we don't normally allow guests, or something like that. So that's an example of something else that might meet the person's needs. Another example. Suppose, and this example is one that I have actually had multiple times. A tenant requests to transfer to a first floor unit. A tenant wants to transfer to a first floor unit because there's no elevator. Well, what if there is no first floor unit available, right? I mean, a landlord can't just kick somebody out of a first floor unit just for someone with a disability. That would not be fair, right? There's no first floor units available. A landlord can't accommodate the person in that instance. A landlord, as in the interactive process, could suggest, what if I put you on a waiting list for the next first floor unit that is available? You are at the top of the waiting list, you'll get the next unit. That might work for the person, or maybe as part of the interactive process, they could say, I don't have a first floor unit. If you need one right now, I will, I just don't have one. If you really need a unit with a first floor, I will allow you to break your lease without penalty so that you can find housing where you don't have any stairs. That could be another option that might work for the person. The last example, which I kind of alluded to before, someone makes a request, like maybe they made a request for they need a closer parking space. They need a closer parking space to the front of the building, but they haven't provided any documentation to support their request for that closer parking space. Like any support from a doctor or anything. Why do they need that space? In that case, again, the landlord shouldn't just say, it's denied because you haven't provided us enough information. In that case, as part of this process, the landlord should say, we need more information, and this is what we need and why. So those are some examples of the interactive process at work. Direct threat, I mentioned before what direct threat was. Direct threat is one circumstance when a landlord can deny an accommodation if there is a threat to health or safety of others or property of others. And as I said previously, no other accommodations will eliminate that direct threat. Remember, we still have that requirement for that interactive process. So even if there is a direct threat, the landlord needs to see is there any other way that I can accommodate this person so that there won't be a direct threat. Let me give you an example of this. Suppose we have a tenant who gets into a fight with their neighbor, and our tenant, our client, threatens the neighbor and physically attacks the neighbor. That is violating the lease because that's a violation of the lease, and the landlord also finds out that the tenant has physically threatened other tenants at the property. The landlord in that case gives the tenant a notice, an eviction notice. So that would make sense, right? To give someone an eviction notice for that. And in that case, suppose that the person that made the tenant had a disability that caused them to be more violent, like a mental disability that caused them, when they were not in treatment, when they were not on their medication, to have violent outbursts and potentially threaten or attack others. So if a lawyer, if someone or anybody asks on behalf of that tenant an accommodation, please rescind your eviction notice, because these are not actions of a normal tenant. These are actions of somebody that has a disability. So make them an exception, because this person did these actions because of their disability. Well, that's an example of a direct threat, right? In that situation, that person is a health or safety threat to others, right? So if those are the only facts we know, in that case, it would be a direct threat, and it would be reasonable probably for the landlord to say no, this person is dangerous, we're not going to let them stay. But what if the tenant or someone advocating on behalf of the tenant said, this person gets violent when they're off their medications, but they were off their medications when these events happened. They are now on their medications. They are now in counseling. They're now in treatment. They're now regularly taking their medication. There's somebody monitoring them regularly to make sure that they're on their medication. These are assurances that provide that someone can provide the landlord that the person, even though they were a danger at one point, these are assurances that it's not going to be a threat going forward, right? So in that situation, that could eliminate the direct threat. And in that case, the landlord should take another look and should consider whether to withdraw that eviction notice. So as I said, we're going to work through a reasonable accommodation request on behalf of our pretend client, Jack. And we're going to do it in the form of a request for an emotional support animal, because that's just really a really common request. So we're going to talk about it step by step. And as I, remember, I had those different steps that we go through. And that's not like required that you go through the steps in this order. It's just, to me, it makes it easier to think about it this way. So I don't have polls here, so let's just think about these in your head, okay? Jack has PTSD. Jack, our client Jack, your client Jack has post-traumatic stress disorder. He has trouble sleeping at night because of his nightmares, and he also has trouble leaving the house because of his responses to stress. Okay, that's all we know. Question number 1, is he a person with a disability? I am hoping that it did not take you long to answer yes to that. In some of the other examples, I might ask for someone to read, for Nastasha to read some of the comments, but I know that you all know Jack is a person with a disability, right? He has a physical impairment. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, yes, sorry about that. Yeah, there are several yeses in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Yes, he has a physical impairment that substantially a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. In this case, one of his major life activities is sleeping. So yes, he is a person with a disability. Okay, he's met step 1. Okay, step 2. Jack wants to bring a dog to the property. He wants to bring a dog to the property to calm him down when he has anxiety attacks. An emotional support animal that calms him down, helps calm down his anxiety related to his PTSD. Is the accommodation, is it necessary? We don't know what he's actually asking for yet, but is it necessary? Is there, well, okay, let me tell you what the accommodation is, because maybe you're thinking, well, what's necessary? In this situation, suppose that there's a no pets policy at Jack's building, and he's going to be asking for an exception to that no pets policy, okay, for his emotional support animal. So he has a dog that he brings to the property to calm him down. Is it necessary? Yeah. Well, is the dog necessary? Yeah, the dog lessens the effects of his disability, right? So in that case, yes. So it's necessary for him to have that emotional support animal. It lessens the effects of his disability. Now here comes the request. Here's the reasonable accommodation. So Jack gives a copy of his doctor's note to the landlord, along with a short letter asking the landlord to let him have a dog, even though the apartment has a no pets policy. Has Jack made a reasonable accommodation? Has he made a request here for a reasonable accommodation or exception or change to a rule or a policy? I am hoping that most of you or all of you say yes. The answer is yes. He has made a request here for an exception to that no pets policy. Before we move on, I'm going to answer a bunch of questions that are triggered by this slide. I'm going to preempt some of your questions, hopefully, to answer some things. Number 1, people always ask, does it have to be a doctor? Does it have to be a doctor that verifies the disability? Does Jack have to give a doctor's letter, or can it be somebody else? The answer is no. It does not have to be a doctor. And HUD guidance on reasonable accommodations and modifications, it is pretty clear, and in case law too, there is no requirement that it be a doctor. And in fact, there's no requirement that it be anyone in the healthcare profession at all. The guidance only says that it needs to be someone who's familiar with the person's disability. Well, actually, okay, so the exact language in the guidance is somebody that's in a position to know about the person's disability. So if you're working with a client who you know has a disability and you're not a medical professional, you may be able to write this verification letter. Now, if I'm working with a client that has a doctor or a psychologist that's willing to verify, I usually just ask for them to write the letter because it's easy, and just the landlords tend to grant it faster, ask fewer questions. So, I mean, if they have one, great, but it's definitely not a requirement that it be a doctor or that it be a medical or someone in the healthcare field at all. And I had another note here that I wanted to, something else I want to say here. So here he made the request in writing, right? He had a short letter that the request for the request. The request does not have to be in writing either. There is no requirement that the request for a reasonable accommodation be in writing. There is no requirement that it be on a specific form. Sometimes landlords have or housing authorities have specific forms that they want people to use to fill out, like their special reasonable accommodation forms. And those forms are great. There's nothing wrong with those forms. Sometimes those forms help tenants, especially people making requests that don't have advocates working with them, to kind of help guide them to articulate what they're asking for and provide the information. But if someone has a form and the person making the request doesn't use that exact form or makes the request verbally, that is not grounds to deny the request. There's no requirement that it be on a specific form or in writing. Now, as a lawyer, I always say, and you probably can see why, I always think it's better to put it in writing, right? Because then you have a paper trail of it, especially if you think that the landlord is not going to be, not going to work with you, right? Is going to be confrontational. If you have it in writing, that's great proof later that the person of how that landlord acted, but there's no requirement. But I always say, if you can put it in writing, it's a good best practice, right? And then the last thing I wanted to say on this slide is when do you have to have verification? Because it's not always the case that you need to provide a letter from a doctor or from somebody else verifying your disability and verifying your accommodation request. So if it's a disability that, and here's kind of the parameters. If it's a disability that is obvious or apparent, and the request is obvious or apparent, then there's no requirement. Then the person does not have to provide verification. So the easiest example I have of that is somebody in a wheelchair asks for a ramp, asks as a reasonable accommodation for a ramp. That person would it be reasonable to ask that person to prove that they have a disability? No, it would not. And would it be reasonable to ask that person for verification why they need a ramp? Also, no. In those cases, the disability and the request is so obvious connected. In that case, the landlord wouldn't have the right to ask for more information. But that's most cases are not that clear cut, right? So if the disability is obvious or apparent, but the need is not obvious or apparent, then the landlord does have the right not to ask about the disability if they can tell that the person's disabled by that it's an obvious disability, but they don't understand why the person, what they're asking for is related to their disability, then they do have the right to ask for more information on how it's connected to their disability. Like maybe somebody in a wheelchair asks for a service animal and it's not really clear how that service animal helps that person in the wheelchair. The landlord may have the right to ask for someone to verify how those two are related. But I would say 99%, 95% of the cases that I work with, and definitely in 100% of the cases with mental disabilities asking for accommodations, most of them are not apparent, are not obvious, right? Most of the time, the landlord does have the right to ask for verification, not of the person's diagnosis. A landlord never has the right to ask what the actual diagnosis is. They just have the right to find out what is the physical, how their activity, how their disability, substantially limits a major life activity. The person can disclose they have the right to disclose their diagnosis if they want to, but they're not required to. So now somebody who maybe has, I guess, arthritis someone with a physical disability, maybe they have arthritis in their knee. I don't necessarily have to give them proof, okay, this person has arthritis in their knee. I could just say they have a disability that affects their ability to walk or affects their mobility. Or with a mental disability, this person, I have a person with a mental disability that affects their ability to concentrate or to sleep. A lot of times, in my experience, a lot of times clients don't have a problem disclosing their diagnosis. Sometimes they're happy to disclose it just because then, like I said, it just raises fewer questions, but sometimes they don't, and they definitely do not have an obligation to, especially sometimes for mental disabilities. They don't want the landlord to know what the diagnosis is, and that's fine. They aren't required to. So I think that's all I have on that. That was a lot, but I knew that this slide would raise a lot of questions. So hopefully I answered all the things that you may have thought of on this slide. Okay, moving on. Step 4. Is the request reasonable? Is his request reasonable? Does it impose an undue financial or administrative burden? I will answer. I will, in the interest of time, I will just answer this for you. Yeah, it is reasonable. There's no financial or administrative burden, most likely, on a landlord in granting a request for someone to have an emotional support animal. Now, if the animal causes damage to the property afterward, like maybe they have a dog and the dog scratches up the hardwood floors or destroys the grass outside, the tenant isn't picking up after the animal, doing things like that, the landlord does have the right to still charge the person, right, for actual damage to the property, or to require that the dog, that the tenant pick up after their animal, after the animal. But there's no financial burden at the outset in just granting the request. The request in this situation is reasonable. Step 5, is there a direct threat? Suppose Jack's dog is a pit bull, but his emotional support pit bull has never bitten or attacked anyone. Is there a direct threat here? And think about it for a minute. I'll let you think about it. Is there a direct threat? Is there a threat to health or safety with a pit bull as an emotional support animal? So the answer is no. And because remember something I said before, the direct threat exception cannot be based on stereotypes about, and in here, some people have stereotypes that pit bulls are dangerous, but unless the landlord knows that particular pit bull has attacked or bitten someone, that probably could be a direct threat, right? That would be an exception. But absent that, just the fact that it is a pit bull, that is not in and of itself a direct threat. Oh, this is my favorite. This is my favorite slide. So same facts as before, but this time Jack asks for a emotional support hamster, not an emotional support dog. It's an emotional support hamster. What do you think should happen in this situation? Any thoughts? Anyone want to say? Well, I'll go ahead.
Yeah, so there's a couple, someone said, sure, same thing, yes, still accommodation, same process as a dog. Yes, it's okay. Yes, it's okay. Okay. Still have to allow him, even though he's a hamster, same as before. Yes, it's okay, not a problem.
Okay, great. So every one of those is correct. Yes, it is okay. And here's why. So before 2020, if I would have been giving you this presentation before 2020, I would have told you any animal, the guidelines were basically any animal can be an emotional support animal, like a hamster, a pig, a horse, a monkey, a turtle, a cat, any animal can be an emotional support animal. In 2020, HUD released guidance specifically on emotional support animals and service animals in housing. And that's really good guidance on kind of like limiting on how they analyze these requests, on how and how housing providers should look at these requests for emotional support animals and service animals. And in that guidance from HUD, it says that an emotional support animal or service animal can be what they call any common household pet. Any common household pet. And I wrote some down here. I mean, obviously cats. So what they describe as common household pets in the guidance is like obviously a dog, a cat, a small bird, a rabbit, a hamster, gerbil, other rodents, fish, turtles, or other small domesticated animals that are traditionally kept in the home. They give examples of animals that are not traditionally common household pets, like barnyard animals, monkeys. You can guess some of these, right? Horses, kangaroos, non-domesticated animals. HUD is not saying that these other animals, you cannot have them as emotional support animals. That is not true at all. They are just saying that if you are asking for an accommodation for an animal that is not usually a pet, that is not usually kept in the home and domesticated, there's a higher standard that you may have to meet in order to have your request granted. And in those situations, a landlord has the right to ask for more information on why you need that specific animal and why your disability cannot be accommodated by a common household pet, and why it needs to be one of these not common household pets. So they give an example in the guidance of like a monkey that is able, I can't remember what they said, that's able to use his hands, I think maybe to open prescription bottles, I think, or something for the person with the disability. And in that case, that would be an example of why someone might die. I can't not think of a common household pet that would have that skill to use their hands to open a prescription bottle for someone with a disability. So in that case, that would be a good example of explaining why they need a non-common household pet. To finish up my presentation, I want to tell you just a few takeaways on how to support clients who are making reasonable accommodation and reasonable modification requests. Well, I think the first way you can support them is really just being here and learning about it. Now that you know what it is, or maybe you knew and now maybe hopefully you've learned more, just being able to identify it is a great asset to clients, because so many people that need accommodations and modifications, they kind of know that what they need, but they can't really articulate it, or they don't know that it's a legal right of theirs. So just being able to help your client identify or that that they have this right, that they can ask for this, is really great way to support clients. Besides that, helping to identify an opportunity. Another way that you can support clients is helping them make the request. I mean, I help clients make requests for accommodations all the time, and I'm sure other attorneys and fair housing advocates do too, but there's no requirement that it be someone that with a fair housing background or a lawyer. A lot of social service providers and caseworkers, before they get someone else involved, they help their client make the request, maybe help the person write down or kind of explain it, help them fill out forms, things like that. That's another great way that you could help a client with a request for an accommodation or a modification. Also, writing a letter to verify the disability. You know, like I said before, it does not have to be a healthcare professional, right? It does not have to be a doctor verifying that the person has a disability or that the person needs what they need, this accommodation. If you work with a client with a disability and you know that person well, you may be in a position to write that letter to offer that support to the client. That's another great way that that you could support a client of yours making a request, is writing those letters supporting the request on behalf of that client. And like I said, making sure everything is in writing. It's just a good thing to remember, like with everything that you do with a landlord, if you want that you think might have a legal issue later, not just in fair housing. I mean, it's always good to keep everything in writing just for proof, but especially with reasonable accommodations, if things are in writing, that's the best proof we have, as opposed to, you know, oral requests. So that's another great way to support your client, just making sure things are in writing. If things don't go well, suppose you have a client who, you know, wants someone else to help them, a lawyer or fair housing advocate to support them, or maybe they've made the request and it hasn't gone very well. You can also help your clients, put them in touch with legal aid organizations or fair housing organization. And if you don't know who a good organization to contact in your service area, CAFHA, the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance, who's, you know, co-sponsoring this event, is a great resource to help connect you with one of its partner organizations, legal aid organizations. There's also a great website many of you may be familiar with, Illinois Legal Aid Online, and that, I think it's all one word, Illinois Legal Aid Online. I can't remember if it's .org or .com, but that one, that's the way you can apply for legal aid all across the state, actually. Help clients make a timeline. That's really helpful for me when I work with clients, is having them kind of know from start to finish a timeline of what happened and when, keeping everything organized. It just helps the process for someone that's going to be advocating on behalf of someone with a fair housing violation. It just helps them, you know, make things smoother and make the complaint process easier. And then also, you can help a client file a complaint with HUD, or IDHR, the Illinois Department of Human Rights. You can help them do that on their own. There's no requirement that they use a lawyer to do that. Those are the agencies that enforce the fair housing laws, and certainly if they have a lawyer, that's great. I mean, I do help clients a lot file fair housing complaints, but there's you don't have to have a lawyer for that. It's pretty easy. The forms online to file a complaint are pretty easy. They're not like complicated like court complaints. It's basically just like putting your information, putting in the landlord's information, writing, and then there's kind of questions, paragraphs of explain what happened to you and why you think this is discrimination. And so a lot of clients, even in those cases, it's really helpful for them to have someone that's an advocate working with them, just helping them kind of organize their thoughts and putting that in writing. So as I mentioned, the HUD and IDHR are the two administrative agencies who enforce fair housing laws. So clients can file complaints, fair housing complaints, regarding reasonable accommodations and modifications or any violation, fair housing violations, they can file them with HUD or IDHR, and the information to do that is on both of their websites. There is a 1-year statute of limitations, meaning that you have to file the complaint within 1 year of when the most recent date of discrimination happened. It's free to file. The first step before litigation is a very lengthy investigation, where a non-attorney investigator for one of those agencies, usually IDHR, that's where most of the complaints end up. Even complaints that are filed with HUD, most of them end up getting sent to IDHR just because HUD, because they have like a partnership. So IDHR will take a lot of the complaints from HUD. It is a lengthy process. Sometimes it can take months, but or longer. But as part of the investigation, the investigator will interview the person who is who's making the violation, and you as a provider are certainly welcome to be there with the person. Most of the time, unless you request that it be in person, it's usually on the phone. The investigator will then interview the other side. They'll interview any witnesses any side may have. They'll ask for paperwork or proof, and then at the end of that, they'll come up with a report of whether they think there's substantial evidence of discrimination or a lack of substantial evidence of discrimination. And they're not saying that whether there's a fair housing violation or not. They just make a determination. Is there enough to go forward with a fair housing complaint? Is there enough here to go forward? And if there's enough of a question that there is a fair housing violation, then the case gets sent to the Human Rights Commission. And that's when the case is actually litigated in front of the Human Rights Commission, in front of an administrative law judge. And at that point, it does get pretty complicated, and having an attorney at that point is extremely helpful. People can settle at any time. I mean, you don't have to go through litigation. If at any time in there, if the sides want to settle, that's great. You can always stop proceedings to see if you can come up with some kind of a solution that'll satisfy your client. And then the other option is you can file. Clients can file in state or federal courts if they don't want to file with HUD or IDHR. That has a little bit longer statute of limitations. They can file within 2 years of the last date of discrimination. It's a little more complicated, like it says here, easier with an attorney. There's usually costs, fees to pay, and then you have to pay for serving, for filing, for serving the other parties with summons. Sometimes clients that are low income can get certain fee waivers from the court, but some clients are not eligible for that. And in court, you can ask for punitive damages. You can't do that administratively. And you can do both at the same time if you wanted to. There's no rule that you have to do one or the other. Sorry, I was talking fast at the end. I know I hope I answered a lot of questions, but that's kind of I just wanted to get through everything. That's the end of my presentation. This will be available. Here is my contact information, which will also be available in the slideshow that you receive. But, if we don't get to your question today, please feel free to call me, or that's my direct line, that's my email. And that number at the bottom is a toll-free number. That's our Fair Housing, FHP stands for Fair Housing Project, Prairie State Legal Services, PSLS. That's a toll-free number that you can feel free to give to clients who may be victims of discrimination. And I do review those calls every day, and we see, see where we would, if we can assist them, and where in Prairie State we can assist them. So that's everything. Sorry, I talked for so long. That's the end. Are there any questions?
And Maya, I just wanted to highlight a few things. So first of all, thank you so much for your presentation, and Nastasha, thank you for yours too. We have a lot of questions, so I've compiled them into a document. And I think what we'll try to do is maybe if we can get through just a couple, and then we can maybe just kind of coordinate with you and maybe just kind of address some of the questions. I think some of these items you already covered as you were presenting. And so I just want to highlight a few here. And I'm going to kind of work my way backwards. I'm going to ask a question that was towards the end and then ask a question towards the beginning. There were several questions around service and emotional. I'm sorry, it sounds like there's feedback. There were several questions around service and emotional support animals. And specifically even around one, this question of whether a landlord can legally require proof of documentation from clients. Then also there were questions regarding just reasonable accommodations and modifications in general, and if there's any difference when a person is either renting a home or maybe renting a condo, and just the process that it might have to go through with a condo association or board. So I know it's like kind of combining some questions, but wanted to get those out.
Those are good questions. I hope I answered that first part about can a landlord require it. I kind of talked about that a little bit when we went through that that fact pattern, that it depends, right? It's that kind of that, like, in most cases, that if it's not, if it's not an apparent disability, if the connection to what they're asking for is not obvious, then they can require it. They only can't require it if the disability is easily apparent or obvious, and if what they're asking for is pretty easy, if it's easy to find the connection. Most of the time they do have the right, but like I said before, they don't have the right to ask about a diagnosis. And then to answer the second part of your question, that's really good question. Who does it apply to? Yeah, it applies to apartments and homes and federal funded housing and non-federal funded housing. Under the Federal Fair Housing Act, there is an exemption. There are some exemptions. There are certain landlords that are not covered by fair housing laws. If they're like a really small landlord, like if it's an apartment building that has 4 or fewer units and the landlord resides in one of those units, that's one of the exemptions. Or I think if it's a single family home that they're renting and they're not using a real estate agent or broker, that's another exemption where they wouldn't have to follow the fair housing laws. But that's under the Federal Fair Housing Act. The Illinois equivalent, the Illinois Human Rights Act, does not have, they do have exemptions too, but they don't have that exemption. So I would say, yeah, everybody has to follow these reasonable accommodation and modification requirements.
Great. And I think just one other question I will throw out here, because I think most of these have been covered through your presentation. Well, I'll ask this one. So regarding reasonable modifications, can a person with mobility issues request a different bathtub, even if the person, and this again is a person if they're renting from a home, but it says, would this modification impact the amount of the rent, and would it be the landlord's financial responsibility to make those changes?
If it's in private housing, it's up to the tenant. The tenant has to figure out how to pay it. It has nothing to do with the rent. But if the person's asking about like in public housing or in subsidized housing, no, they just have to pay it outright. They just pay for it. They just have to pay for it. There's no like, they just pay for it as it happens. Does that make sense? Yeah, I hope I answered that question.
Yeah, I think you answered that well. And with that said, again, since we're coming out to the end of our time, Maya's presentation will be available, and we're going to send all of the presentations at the end of this series on November 16th. What we will also do is just try to work on, maybe we'll develop kind of a running document with different questions that have been raised and we weren't able to get to at our different sessions, and just try to provide a little background for you. But you'll also have her contact information so that you can get in touch with her. The only other thing that we want to share is that those who do participate in all 4 sessions will get a certificate of completion. Unfortunately, we will not be able to provide CEUs, so continuing education units. If that changes, we will let you know, but that's kind of where we are now. And so just want to thank Maya again. This was just such a fantastic presentation. And those of you who are participating in the rest of the series, we will see you next week, November 2nd at 10:30. Have a good afternoon and rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Maya.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks, everybody.